So now, ختامها مسك with Michael Cooperson.
Yeah.
أنا تحت الأوامر والله.
We are very honored to have you with us, Michael, and it's my distinct honor to introduce you. Michael Cooperson is professor of Arabic at UCLA, where he teaches pre-modern Arabic literature as well as translation from Arabic to English, the life of Ibn Hanbal, his translation of Ibn al-Jawzi's biography of the Imam, received the 2016 Sheikh Hamad Prize for Translation and International Understanding. And this year, his Englishing of the Maqamat of Hariri, titled Impostors, won the Sheikh Zayed Book Award for Translation. His research interests include early Abbasid cultural history, Maltese language and culture, and time travel as literary device. Professor Fatima Keshvares launched this conference by citing an episode in which a Persian, an Arab, a Greek, and a Turk all want to eat grapes, but they can't understand each other and run the risk of going hungry. Had Michael Cooperson been there, you all know they would have eaten grapes. But not only that, if you've seen Impostors, you know they would have had grape juice, grape jam, vinegar, wine, and every other manifestation of grape under the sun. When I think of Michael Cooperson's work, I remember the ever-present Yaroslav Statkevich's words when he describes the ideal student and scholar of the Arabic literary tradition, for whom Arabic itself offers a distinct, special pleasure reserved only for those most loyal to it. And Michael Cooperson is such a scholar. He is a role model to many of us here and out in the world, and we are very honored to have him. So please join me in welcoming him, and we look forward to hearing from him about learning Arabic in pre-modern times. Michael.
Huda, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's so much more than I deserve, and I'm very grateful to you and to Hany and to David for bringing all of us together. It's a pleasure to see so many old friends and to meet so many brilliant scholars all in one place. So thank you so much for doing this. So for the past 3 days, we've been making, or you have been making, sophisticated literary judgments about languages that may be your second or third or fourth or fifth language. And you've been doing it in languages that may be your second or third or fourth or fifth language. And as usual in our Sunnah, this passes unremarked. We don't talk about this. In fact, it's in all of our professional interests to occlude or elide the effort that goes into this and the labor that goes into it, and often the pain and humiliation that are part of attaining real proficiency in someone else's language and culture and world. So I actually want to dig into that a little bit, not with us, so relax, but with people in the past, and to look at what happens when someone is othered linguistically. And that's my translation of Ajami or A'ajam, the one who is othered linguistically. I think it's important that we celebrate and explore the extent to which pre-modern Islamic societies were multilingual, but I think that we can appreciate their achievement, the achievement of our predecessors, more vividly if we understand some of the pain that went into it. And that's what I want to dig into today. Now, in giving a paper on how people learned Arabic in pre-Islamic times, or in pre-modern times, sorry, I'm not endorsing that language's claim to epistemic primacy, and I'm not celebrating the erasures that have come about as a result of that claim. It's really quite the opposite. I'm actually looking at what happens when a linguistically othered subject is called upon to submit to the demands of a hegemonic language. So this is the moment when I'm going to share my screen. And it looks like it's working. Fantastic. So I'm going to dig into 3 cases. And I have accumulated a few references to theories about how people learn language, about foreigners learning language, and I'm happy to share those with anyone who reaches out to me. But today I thought I would focus more on the practical, and I want to say how much I appreciate Dr. Suhail Laher's paper, who brings up this question of, talking about language theoretically versus talking about it as a practical matter. So the person I want to start with is Bishr al-Hafi, who was an ascetic who became famous in Baghdad in the early Abbasid Caliphate, although in fact he was from Marv. And this is pointed out by his biographers, who note that, for example, Sulami says he was from Marv, from a village, and I haven't been able to pick out these names exactly, but there they are as they're given in the edition. So he then moves to Baghdad and dies there. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi adds a detail which I couldn't resist including, that he was an OG, he was an original gangster back in his youth. كان يتفتى في أول أمره وقد جرح. So he was wounded as a result of this. So it's not really clear how he ends up then becoming a pious figure, but he does. He moves to Baghdad, and he's on the fringes of the hadith movement, which he then rejects because he feels that the hadith scholars talk the talk but don't walk the walk. And so he reproaches them, and his reproaches of them contain some interesting linguistic, let's call them parapraxes, and let's take a look at them. So in this one, he says, he's reproaching a friend, and he says, احذر حدثنا فإن لحدثنا حلاوة وقد قلت حدثنا وكتب عنك فكان ماذا. So one translation of that would be that last part is so what? So what? In another little aphorism, he says, أنا أشتهي يحدث وإذا اشتهيت شيئا تركته. And so a translation of that might be, I have a craving to teach hadith. And so this is part of his asceticism, that he doesn't do it for that reason. Now, what strikes me here, though, is that these uses of Arabic strike me as perhaps indicative of a non-native speaker's performance. And the reason I think that it's plausible that they might be preserved is that Bishr is in a milieu where everyone is trained in verbatim transmission of oral performance. So whether they meant to or not, these people who'd been trained from a very young age to copy everything just as they heard it may have preserved these uses of language that strike me as deviant, perhaps, from a certain norm. Now, one of the ways that we elide this, that we erase this kind of non-normativity, is in translation. So here is what happens if we were to put it back, right? So we might try it, this was hard, but then was what? The other one's easier because, let's say, something typical in English as an error would be to eliminate the indefinite article. So you could have him say, I have craving to teach hadith, and so on. So this is the kind of thing where, there are reasons that one might want to do it, and one might not want to do it, but we are participating in the erasure of non-normative performance when we translate always into a kind of standard language. Let's look at what happens, though, when Bishr is actually called out on this. And this is one of my favorite stories in Arabic, I have to admit. So here it goes. قال محمد بن المثنى السمسار كنا عند بشر وعنده العباس بن عبد العظيم العنبري وكان من سادات المسلمين فقال له يا أبا نصر أنت رجل قرأت القرآن وكتبت الحديث فلما لا تتعلم العربية ما تعرف به اللحن حتى لا تلحن. So he's called out on it by this apparently very impressive figure. So what does Bishr do? He says, وَمَنْ يُعَلِّمُنِي يَا أَبَا الْفَضْلِ. So Abu al-Fadl, of course, can't say anything but, well, I guess I will. أَنَا يَا أَبَا نَصْرِ. So he says, all right, go for it. فِفْعَلْ. So he gives him the sentence. قَدْ ضَرَبَ زَيْدٌ عَمْرًا. So what does Bishr say? Probably something no one's ever said, or maybe people did say it. يَا أَخِي لِمَا ضَرَبَهُ. And the answer is, يا أبا نصر ما ضربه وإنما هذا أصل وضع. So this sentence, this paradigmatic sentence, he says, no, it's not real. No one hit anybody. It's just so that you can learn your grammar. And what does Bishr say in response? قال له بشر هذا شيء أوله كذب لا حاجة لي به. So this story, I think, shows two things. One is that Bishr's language actually throughout is normative, so that if he were speaking in a way that is deviant, in any sense. That has not been preserved for us. So for example, he correctly uses the vocative form when he says, ya Aba al-Fadl, which is difficult. And so I wonder whether that's something that he actually did learn, or whether it's something that that was corrected for him subsequently. But what I like is the resistance then, is this idea that he's called out as an Ajami, and he's asked to correct his language to conform to the norm, and he essentially refuses, because the story is there to emphasize that he's interested in the essence of piety, whereas some of his colleagues he feels may be interested in these sciences that are supererogatory or unnecessary. And that's the way the story shows it. Now, this raises the question of whether, in fact, people did learn Arabic this way. And I've decided to put off for another occasion the evidence I have about how this was actually done. But I'll share with you just one brief example. Books like the Grammar of Sibawayh and other grammar books are useless for teaching anybody anything, unless you happen to be someone interested in linguistics. But they're not teaching books. One book that may have been, I think, is the Tafsir of Muqatil, because it's so tedious, it's repetitive, it's obvious in such a way that I think it would have been enormously boring for anyone able to understand the Quran when they heard it, but incredibly helpful to anyone who was learning Arabic this way. So, I mean, ESL, so applied linguists tell us that you need to see something 16 times before it sticks, like a new piece of vocabulary. Well, he tells you every single time it says Rusul or Rasul that it's Muhammad, for example. And so there's a kind of plodding repetitiveness about this that makes it fantastically useful for teaching Arabic. So I think it's more likely people learned Arabic this way than by having people throw grammatical theory at them. But that's a separate question. Now, moving on to what happened when you learned a bit more, let's go to Basra and to the maqamat. So this is an example of a manuscript of Al-Hariri, and as you know, Al-Hariri's maqamat and maqamat in general are deliberately difficult. And so imagine then trying to learn Arabic from something like that. It's like learning English from Finnegan's Wake or something equally rebarbative. But it turns out that we have ample evidence from manuscripts of people not only scribbling glosses in Arabic on their copy of the maqamat, but even in other languages. So this, for example, is the first attestation of a Northwestern Iranian language called Gilaki. And I'm sorry for the poor scan, but what you see here is the page, the writing of Hariri, and under it is the Gilaki translation. So clearly this is not about, as we might imagine from reading the maqamat, this is not proficient native speakers trying to up their game. Well, no doubt those people were involved, but just as likely you would have with you in the majlis an Ajami who was busy writing these things down. And sometimes even in Arabic, the obviousness of some of the things that they felt that they had to explain is such that it doesn't feel that you're looking at a native speaker's copy of the book. Now, what is striking about the maqamat, as many of you doubtless know, is that even if it's all about learning, which is something that's been argued very well by Matthew Keegan, there's no reference to any other language. All other languages have been silenced, they've been erased. But I think that this pursuit of Arabic, this impossible pursuit of this unattainable ideal of perfect language, is transposed to the level of plot, where you have Al-Harith moving from one place to another, as he says, from Ghana to Farghana, looking for adab, looking for eloquence, and always finding Abu Zayd. So here, for example, he says, طح بي مرح الشباب وهوى الاكتساب إلى أن جبت ما بين فرغانة وغانا وأخوض الغمار لأجني الثمار واقتحم الأخطار لكي أدرك الأوطار. So moving from place to place in search of the word, in search of the word. And Michael Rand, in his in his book on the Hebrew maqama, Al-Hariz's Hebrew maqamat, I think captures this very well when he says that the function of the geographical names, almost every maqama is named after a place, is not to chart a particular route, but rather to create a general sense of motion and restlessness. And goes on to say that the maqama form is suited for representing movement as such, not telic movement from a starting point to an end. So the idea is that this perfect eloquence in Arabic is unattainable, but the feeling of always getting better at it is the element that's transposed on the level of plot, where you have these characters endlessly moving around. Now, this notion of Arabic being an unattainable kind of knowledge is one that has been very well expressed by Georgine Ayoub, where she talks about how in the philological tradition, Al-Arabiya is essentially the language that's being spoken always by someone somewhere else. So if you're in a city, well, it has to be out in the desert. But if you're out in the desert, it can't be the Banu Tamim. It needs to be somebody else. And you go there and you go there and it never ends. And so quite literally, if you were to follow people's directions about where Al-Arabiya is located, you would never stop moving. My last example takes us from Central Asia to Damascus and Cairo to Al-Bahai al-Ghuzuli, who is the compiler of an adab anthology called Matali' al-Budur fi Manazil al-Surur, which is one of my favorite titles in the world. I actually read the whole book just because of that. I don't work on this period, but I love the title so much, I just had to read it. And so that's how I ended up quite far off from my familiar stomping grounds. So Al-Bahai al-Ghuzuli is described by his biographers as having been a ghulam Turki. And Turki in that period can cover a multitude of ethnicities and languages, so it's not really clear what he spoke or who he was. But what did happen is that he ends up in Damascus and apparently ended up working in some part of the fabric trade. So he has the name al-Ghuzuli. We have testimony about him in the biography by As-Sakhawi, who says this about al-Ghuzuli. تعانى النظم فلم يزل يقوم ويقعد إلى أن جاد شعره. So al-Ghuzuli sets out as a foreigner, as a non-native speaker, to produce Arabic poetry. And Sakhawi says, well, he worked so hard at it that he eventually managed to do it. But he couldn't recite it. Because Sakhawi goes on to tell us that Abu Bakr al-Munajjim made fun of al-Ghuzuli in this poem, where he says, يَسْمَعُ جَيِّدًا وَيَفْهَمُ لَكِنْ مَا يَقُولُ شِيءٍ. So you can imagine then al-Ghuzuli sitting in the majlis night after night, listening, right? Which is something that any of you who have studied a language in its live context have no doubt done a great deal. So what is al-Ghuzuli's side of it? What is al-Ghuzuli's side of it? Very unusually, we have that because at the end of his book, the Matali' al-Budur, he says, I hope you like my book, but if you don't, get over it because it was really hard for me to write. And here's why. He says, I suffer. He says, well, let's back up. Sorry. The poetry, he tells us how he wrote this poetry. Doesn't have much of his own poetry in it, but he talks about how he did it. And he says, the learner should hum poetry to himself as he works. Now, if you imagine that he was actually brought as a slave from Central Asia, when he says as he works, he might well mean some kind of manual labor. So with the rhythm of his labor, he says, لِيَتَرَنَّمُ الشِّعْرُ وَقْتَ عَمَلِهِ. And then he flips it around as advice to the reader and says, مَتَى عَصَ الشِّعْرُ فَاتْرُكُهُ وَمَتَى طَوَعَكَ فَعَوِّدُهُ وَرَوِّحُ الْخَاطِرِ إِذَا كَلَّ. And all of this is very much what you would advise your students if you're teaching them a language. I mean, there's a kind of familiarity to the things he's saying here, but very rarely confessed by anyone in the sources that I've seen, at least. And then he goes on to say something that we've all told our students, which is you're not going to learn the language unless you find something in it you like to read or like to listen to. So he says, اعمل في أحب المعاني إليك وفي كل ما يوافقه طبعك. فالنفوس تعطي على الرغبة ولا تعطي على الإكراه. So very much, what we would tell students who are learning Arabic today or any other language, that you need to find something that sings to you and use that as the basis for your learning. So he's embodying this learning process. He's sonorizing it. He's making it into, you can see why someone like this would have been able to master the language in the end. But here's what he says at the end of the book. He says, I hope you like it. And if you don't, please understand that I have suffered from عجومة ظاهرة في البيان وعجمة غالبة في اللسان تمنع عن إدراك حقائق المرادات والجمع بين دقائق المعاني وحسن العبارات ولكن مكره في ذلك لا بطل. So he complains of having a foreign accent and a tongue tied in knots, which impede accurate expression and cleave elegance from precision. And yet, what choice have I but to try? Now, one of the things that I'm sure strikes you immediately is that he is, by using this term urjuma or ujma, he's calling on the reader to acknowledge that imperfect speech is sanctioned in the Quran, because the ujma is what Moses suffered when he could not speak. And so that's why Harun has to speak for him. So he's saying that if you don't like this, if you don't like how I sound, understand that prophets have sounded this way as well, which you would think that someone else would have said before him, and no doubt someone has, but I haven't seen that. So he's in a sense validating this ujma in linguistic terms. And his perception of what language teachers call the plateau is absolutely fantastic. I mean, he says, it's not that I don't know the words, it's that I can't say exactly what I mean and sound good doing it at the same time. It's either one or the other. I can come up with beautiful words and I can come up with precise expressions, but to do it at the same time is something that is really hard for me. And then he says, but what choice have I but to try? So he's in a world where whatever his first language was is not one that has any kind of literary validity, that he can't perform it in the majlis. So he's forced to do this as a matter of survival and self-respect, I suppose, if he wants to be part of that world. Now, the two final points then. One is that I think if we consider how many of our authors were probably Ajam, okay, so linguistically othered in some way, and how much written work they managed to produce, we should rethink the idea that at least I have always had, that there was something primarily and fundamentally oral about Arabic literature in all its phases. It's quite clear that for many people, it was a bit like completing a crossword puzzle, and that there's something very visual about it, perhaps, or at least literary in a way that doesn't really have a lot to do with orality. And it's clear that Ghazuli, in a sense, by sitting quiet in the majlis, is resisting that push toward orality, toward performance. He'd rather perform on paper. And I think, again, that's something that all of us have felt at some time or another. But the last point is this. Beginning in the Nahda, there has been a reaction against Arabic rhetoric as a kind of empty formalism, as a kind of privileging of content, of form over content. But what I think we notice if we look at Ghazuli's language is that it's precisely these rhetorical devices that compel you to use certain forms, that make it possible for non-native speakers to construct pleasing sentences, again, on paper. So for example, if we look at what he says about himself, he says, "Ujuma zahira fil bayan." And now he knows, and we know, that what has to happen next by the rules of Saj'a and Tajnis is as follows. He needs another word. You can have pretty much free variation in that first slot. But ideally, it should have ayn, jim, mim, or maybe ghain, or ha, or kha. So anything that replicates the shape of those letters. If it's ala wazn fa'ula, all the better, but if not, no biggie. In the second slot, you need preferably an adjective, ala wazn fa'il or fa'ila. And in the third slot, you need something that ends with n. And so he says, ujma ghaliba fil lisan. And I'm sure that if we all sat here, each one of you could fill that out with some other words. So I think it's this kind of rhetoric, the canons of rhetoric in Arabic, that although we have perhaps been trained to think of them as a kind of empty formalism, I think we can understand them from al-Ghazuli's point of view as a kind of empowerment. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. I'd like to give your hearers, Michael, a chance just to respond real quick before newsflash. I don't want to wrap things up. I want this to go. I won't let it happen indefinitely, but if there are remarks or questions for Michael Cooperson, please, let's, Hany, I see your hand.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael, for this wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot from it. I'm interested in your impression about Muqatil ibn Sulaiman tafsir, and you said it's repetitive and no one can, it's kind of boring source to teach Arabic from it. And I can understand your perspective and your concern. And what strikes me in this particular tafsir, that he has part about how many foreigner words were incorporated inside the Quran itself. So he speaks about Hebrew origin, Persian origin, Greek origin. So he speaks about al-Firdus. It's a bustan, yuhitaha hitan. So Firdus is, he said Greek. I think it was kind of super, because it never been repeated again. And for nowadays, we find many conservative voices saying you cannot say this is a foreign word. And we have Kulinda Linderman. She gave yesterday a really good paper about the Ta'rib and Dakhil. So I wanted also to know your impression about this kind of unique treatment, and very early, because it's considered one of the earliest tafsir in the Islamic history.
Right, and I appreciate your insight into it. I don't know it as well as you obviously do. I think it would be impossible for it not to have a certain historical interest, precisely because it's so early, and it was produced before a great many kind of pieces of Sunni orthodoxy, let's say, come into being. And so naturally he's going to blurt things out that are quite shocking for later readers. And certainly, I mean, I've had students write papers where they push back against me and they say, no, there's all kinds of interesting things in here. And, you know, you're not paying attention to this insight and that, you know, innovation. And I concede all of that. I think, you know, it is a work of interest for many reasons, but I think also, I think that maybe we could agree that it functions on different levels, or that it may not have been written deliberately as a teaching text. And I don't know if I want to argue that necessarily, but I think that it may replicate for us some, I'm wondering if it replicates for us something of what went on in Majalis, where you had people who really did need everything explained. Yeah. And that, you know, whether by intention or whether just for the process of copying and reproduction, the book ends up being so repetitive and so full of things that don't really seem to need explanation, which isn't to say that there aren't other things in it that are really interesting. I concede that, absolutely.
Barbara, please go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to ask the same kind of area. My question is that, well, when reading poetry, which has a sharh, we often encounter the phenomenon that, well, actually the words that we know are explained, and that the ones that we don't know and that are not in Lisan al-Arab and I don't know where are not explained. So I was asking myself, when you gave the example of Rasul each time being explained, if it's like the same phenomenon, or is it really a work where the words that people wouldn't know are also explained? Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I remember that was my first introduction to that was my introduction to reading Arabic poetry, as I was reading Nullicus Delectus, and not only are is the commentary in Latin, but precisely every word that I had trouble with was not explained. And everything I did understand was explained in many Latin paragraphs, so it was multiply frustrating. I should have said more about Muqatil in the sense that part of it is this, and I approached this, and I didn't get into this, but I'll do it now. As I'm sure many of you know, translation has now been theorized into a kind of tool for talking about many different things, about cultural transmission, about even interspecies communication. Emily Apter and others have really built it up into this sort of universal solvent for talking about all kinds of things. I felt as I was preparing this paper that one could do the same for ESL, ASL, applied linguistics. I mean, not simply to talk about how people learn a language, but to theorize it as a metaphor for a lot of other things too. And in looking at Muqatil, one of the things that struck me is what he seems to be doing in many places is exactly what all of us do when you have a student who wanders into your class having missed the first week, right? That student doesn't know so many things that you've already told the other ones, and you can either get angry about it or you can just explain it again. And of course, once you've done that, a third student then enters, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of it, I think, is this kind of extent to which the written form of the book as we now have it probably reflects the sloppy process of how this would have been taught in reality. Another thing that makes it seem like a language teaching tool to me is that so many of us, the hard thing about reading languages is often that a native speaker can supply what is assumed or elided or missing. They just understand that certain things have been left out. Whereas Muqatil puts them in. If there's something in the Quran where there's an assumed li'anna or an assumed fa or an assumed something, he just puts it in, right? So, and how much of teaching is that, right? Now, that doesn't address your question. Yeah, I would say that this is very impressionistic, but I did, when I first got my copy of Muqatil, I started looking up difficult words. I wanted to see what he says about marriage and what he says about samad. And he doesn't say anything interesting, as I recall. So yeah, that's why I don't think it was really tafsir for grown-ups. But again, I'm willing to be corrected on that.
Peter, you've been patient. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Michael, for that little template on ways to think about a lot of important questions. I was thinking I've got Latin glosses on some of my manuscripts of Sarh al-Uyun, and it's exactly the same, that like the guy clearly doesn't know very much Arabic because what he's glossing are like the easiest words like rajul or something. But I just, the thing I just want to question, I like the idea obviously of the pain and suffering of all these ajam trying to reduce the non-othering, but I was wondering if you could add to that just as easily the pain and suffering of the Arabic native speakers. And so there's a bit of an assumption that they'll be better at this. And I was just reminded, like Sakhawi, for instance, said that Makrizi was no good at poetry. And then like, okay, he's good at history, but the poetry is going to leave him behind. And I was also reminded, just as you were talking of in Ibn Bassam's Dakhira, there's a sort of it seems that he's kind of jealous that he's talking about a certain courtier in Andalusia. He says that he could be able to produce wonderful Arabic without having spent all night reading examples of good Arabic from his peers. And so there was one of these points, and it goes exactly what you're saying, which is the reading aspect was quite big. You kind of sit and you swat through all this stuff. But in a way, there seems to be equally an anxiety of Arabic native speakers to be able to do well the Arabic thing. So it's sort of this hegemon without a native population almost, which is scaring everybody equally. I don't know how you think of that.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate it also, I have to say, your paper, because when you show us that people, even who should have known perhaps what the Persian sentence means, fail to get it. That's exactly I think exposing the underbelly to this, shining surface of multilingualism and proficiency that we like to celebrate. Yeah, one of the things I left out because of the time was to talk about the blossoming genre of making fun of native speakers for their mistakes. And of course, it goes back to, all the biographies of grammarians, show people making mistakes, and all the stories about Al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf and all of this. And I simply left that out of the paper. And obviously there's an important social dynamic where you have probably, I mean, if I were to think about it in terms of linguistic history, there's some pretty good evidence from Ahmed al-Jalad and even older work by Wolfhard Heinrichs about the loss of I'rab, and that happened really early. I think Ahmed's work shows that. And then apparently, I guess you would have a kind of re-importation of I'rab as a standard because of written texts or because of assumptions about how other people speak, perhaps. And then once you instill that, you get this fertile field for making mistakes. So you have, I think, Al-Hajjaj asking Bedouin, man, he says, man khatanuk, and he meant to say man khatanak. No, it's the other way. He says man khatanak instead of man khatanuk, who's your father-in-law? But the Bedouin understands it as who circumcised you, and that sort of thing. I mean, but it's such a contrived story, obviously, because who's going to ask someone that? I don't. So in any case, yes, absolutely. I just left it out, and I think it's something that would have to be explored. And I think, whether people were expected to use Arab in a majlis and how that would happen, and is something that needs to be looked at more, as well as the point you raise about people learning by reading. And Abu Nuwas presumably was a native speaker, but then everyone knows the story where he learns to be a poet by memorizing, I think, 1,000 verses and then forgetting them. As Abdel Fattah Kalito points out, how do you make yourself forget, right? I mean, what do you do to make yourself forget the 1,000 verses that you've learned? Well, with Abu Nuwas, he probably just drank them away, I suppose. But yes, something I didn't have time to talk about. So thank you for raising it.
And Huda, you too, huh?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that story about memorize 1,000 verses and then forget them is also sometimes told between Abu Tamam and Buhturi. So Abu Tamam's advice for Buhturi is to do that as well. It's common. How do you make yourself forget? But yeah, thank you, Michael, very much. I was very fascinated by the appearance of Bishr al-Hafi. And I know it's difficult, but are there other examples of people who resisted and asked Lima darabahu? Because I know it's difficult, the deviation is erased out. But again, a tangent here, but maybe a relevant connection. I first learned about Bishr al-Hafi from a poem by Salah Abd al-Sabur, the 20th century Egyptian poet. A very famous poem called Mudhakkarat al-Sufi Bishr al-Hafi, which opens with the khabar. That Bishr was so upset with the world that khala'an alayhi wa rakada fil ramda, and nobody ever saw him again. But the idea is that the connection here is that Salah Abd al-Sabur himself, a native speaker and an Egyptian poet, would always make grammar mistakes in his text, and also mistakes in meter. And when the critics would point them out, he'd say, well, it doesn't matter as long as the mood and the emotion of the poem are getting through. So this idea of experience, which is, it seems very similar to Bishr's position on grammar and how accurate his grammar is. So that just came to mind, and I'm wondering if there are other examples of ones who resisted as opposed to ta'ana al-nadma and took down all the notes.
Thank you. I didn't know that Salah Abd al-Sabur refers to Bishr at all. I wrote about Bishr in my dissertation many years ago and tried to find references to him in as many places as I could, and that one escaped me, so thank you. I haven't found other examples, but that doesn't mean, of course, that they're not there, and I will certainly look out for them. I mean, there are, in the biographies of grammarians, there are multiple examples of how this officiousness about grammar gets people into trouble, and how there's something perhaps a bit silly about correcting other people all the time about things that are perfectly clear to everyone, which is what grammarians do. One of my teachers in Cairo used to always quote, was it, can't remember which early, Ibn al-Ala, I think, where he, at the end of class, he'd always say, "Ma bikum takaka'tum bi katakako'ikum bidhi jannatin fi franqa'u." So, given as a sentence in Al-Marzubani, I think of things that nobody understands and why does he talk this way? So there's a lot of humor around this, but you actually are pointing to something a bit more serious and important, which is, counter discourses to this sort of hegemonic notion of correctness. And, I've only recently started thinking about this. And so it's something I want to explore further. With Bishop in particular, I think he has the poignancy as a character of someone who's caught between two historical moments that I think, I really don't have a license to talk about dead people like this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think that there's a poignancy, a sadness to the fact that he was trapped in a language not his own, and his religious feeling was entirely sincere, and yet he could not express it in a way that, you've made me think maybe, in fact, his sort of anti-hadith position, his sort of he was a countercultural figure for the hadith scholars. And maybe it was because he just didn't want to play that game of memorizing hours and hours worth of material. That was what you had to do to play that game. And he went to Baghdad to learn hadith. And when he walks away from hadith, maybe what he's saying is, you know what, yours is a game for Arabs. And I'm going to play something else, and it doesn't make me any less of a believer than you. It doesn't make me any less sincere than you, but I'm just not playing that game. And then he says some very mean things about the hadith scholars. He says, when I see you, I want to piss. And he says, you don't even pay the zakat. Try applying 2.5% of that stuff you're always saying. So I think, and it's all very kind of crude and mean. And I think maybe it's because he just didn't want to play the game, that language game. But he wasn't yet living in the world that so many of you have talked about, where there's a whole alternative to that kind of knowledge. There wasn't yet Sufism. There wasn't yet transcendental modes of knowing that would help him get out of that without being so cranky about it. He just had this frustration all the time. But, Ibn Arabi hadn't been born yet. So what is he going to do, right? He's just going to sit there and be frustrated.
He went barefoot. That's what he did. That's what the khabar makes it seem, as if this gesture of taking off his shoes and never putting it on again is that walking away from the game, or walking the walk, as you said, barefoot.
Ali, please, guys.
Thank you so much for that amazing lecture. And I just want to ask a question just to get you to talk more, because I'm really enjoying this. I mean, with the 14th, 15th century example, which is my kind of stuff, you bring out sort of, so you're hitting, like, in this multilingual Islamic pre-modern world wherein Arabic has, pride of place. It's an Arabic that, it's an Arabic that's very much, if we think about all the people who've studied it and who've read it, it may have more people who have never really tried to read it out loud properly than people who actually try to speak it, right? And so I'm just really interested in your thoughts as to, like, the context and reading out loud and thinking about the sort of centrality of Arabic. I mean, when do you realize that your reading out loud is not correct, right? Because I'm thinking, and also, like, even thinking of, like, regional. I remember when I was reading texts in Iran and being from America, even though I'm Iranian ancestry, like, trying to pronounce a ba or ta, and then my teacher's getting pissed off at me and being like, just do the i'rab right. They can't do the i'rab themselves. You don't need to pronounce these letters, right? And I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts about this, particularly as somebody who not only knows languages, but you're really good at speaking them too. So.
That's very kind. Gosh, no, this whole experience. I think that when we can break down this barrier, I think that I think I spent the first 20 years of my career trying to imitate my historian friends, whom I admire enormously, and relentlessly crushing any facile connection between my life and the life of people in the past. That any thought I might have in that direction would be a fallacy, and that it needs to be repressed immediately. And, maybe in my older years, I realized that, no, it's not, there's a commonality of experience. Let's ground it actually in the physiology of the brain. Human beings all learn languages the same way. And one of the things that is an easy handle to grasp is what happens when people learn a language from infancy that's not their own. So I didn't have time to talk about it, but we have this documented in the case of Ibrahim al-Mawsili, who grew up in Kirman and then ends up in Kufa, orphaned, goes to the kutab with a bunch of Arab kids, ends up bilingual, perfectly bilingual. And the way people react to him and to other people like this, like Bashar bin Burd, is they literally, Arabs say, ma hadha. They don't even say man hadha. When they hear him speak, they say ma hadha. So that there's a sense in which, people are breaking natural categories, that if you are an Ajami, but you can pronounce your tha and va and all of that, that there's something unnatural about it. And I'm sure all of us who have spoken anybody else's language to any degree of proficiency have this as well. People sort of say, like, what business do you have speaking like that way? Your question as to whether there is documentation of when people start to realize this is fascinating, and I have not found it yet, but I hope to do that. Of course, there are plenty of discussions of mispronunciations of one kind or another. And I remember there's a comment somewhere about Shafi'i being hard to understand because of his own dialect. And again, going back to Ahmed al-Jalad and other linguists who work on this, there was a huge diversity of pronunciation, even among native speakers. And that's something that we forget. They weren't all going around talking like people in the musalsalat, who speak in perfect Arabic and they all sound the same, even no matter what century it is. No, they sounded just as diverse as Arabic speakers today. And so, and occasionally people draw attention to that. But it's remarkable how often it turns out people that you think well, you find in some biographical khabar, it says, oh, he couldn't pronounce zal or whatever. And if we look at the very precise Arabic vocabulary for speech defects, al-thagh and all of those words, clearly that must have been a reflective of something. So yes, I think it would repay notice. There's an article by Gerjan van Gelder about two poets who had accents, and I can send you the reference. And there's also another thing I didn't get to talk about is, what if you're not Muslim? And there's an article by Claire Wilde on whether Christians could use the Quran to learn proper Arabic. When I went back to read Maimonides in Arabic, I realized, oh, he had to learn it late. Like it looked like my students' third year compositions or something. I mean, great thinker, but there's something kind of clunky about the way he writes, but clunky in a kind of fun, Masri way, or what I mean, it was good, but it was different, and so this is stuff that needs to be explored with more seriousness than I'm exploring it right now, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. And to anyone else, I'm open to prolonging the questions for Michael. Oh, Ali's hand's still up. Oh, that's a fossil. Very good. An applauding hand. Well, everyone, it's unenviable to have to even try to synthesize some of what we've been talking about for the last 3 days. It was Dr. Fatima Keshavars who started us out by enforcing an awareness of the importance of travel and how the poetic artifact is conveyed along the Silk Road of literary distribution and understanding, I think her phrase was. And I was most grateful because this enforces an awareness of the materiality of text. Now, for manuscripts, this is well evident. And it was great to see Peter Webb mapping the distribution of the manuscripts and translations of Sarh al-Uyun all around the Mediterranean world and points east. Alauddin Mahmoud was telling us about multimodal production, including even book bindings, and that was important to keep in mind. But for the orally transmitted work, it's quite the same thing. Spoken utterance is material fact. And Talia Fishman reminded us of the legal binding status of some unwritten texts, depending on whether you're in Babylon or Palestine or Qayrawan centuries later. Now, we've heard more in the last 3 days about poetry than law. And poetry has a special status. It's easy to idealize and exempt from materiality, partly because poetry in our day is worth no money. I mean, publishers mostly lose money. So this is one of the reasons that we work to think outside of the norms of our present day. Back to when poetry had less competition from other media, when it was practically coextensive with wisdom itself, despite the admonitions of Nusayr Khosrow's poem that Salur Ibaz Melayeri showed us, where he says to discard ghazal, to throw away panegyric. Of course, he does this in poetry, which hardly needed pointing out. So how to meet Professor Fatima's challenge in terms of thinking about poetry in terms of not just material, but exchange of material goods. And multilingualism is the most revealing rubric for doing this. Sirwan Ali Hariri showed us the translinguistic exchange between population groups right on the surface of the poetry of cosmopolitan Kurdistan. Ali Kajurabari did this with Rumi and Qari Burhanuddin. I'm a Turk, you're a Tartar, I love that. I'm still reeling from Kalinda Linderman's revelation that Rumi uses in his poetry Lughat al-Mukhannathat, that's to say the jargon or the argot of men who live as women. And this was according to Khafaji, and that is a Rumi paper that needs to be written right away. Now, in all these cases, multilingual cases, there is no real separation between meaning and form, yeah? I mean, the linguistic forms are the meaning. Let's step back onto the Silk Road real quickly. I too, Michael, am still in bondage to my historian mentors. The economic historians are good at pointing out that the market, the idea of the market writ large now, that's a modern construction and a modern condition. I mean, albeit early modern, you know, it's not like just yesterday, but exchange is universal. Exchange is practically eternal. So economic historians will speak of embeddedness of exchange within traditional social contexts. I'll give you a quick example. I'm the new neighbor. I'm new in the neighborhood. So one of my new neighbors brings me a plate of halwa. Yeah. Weeks later, I might do them a favor. I might bring up the mail. I might water the rose bush while they're away. I don't know. We wouldn't call that an exchange. We pretend that these are unrelated events, disembodied courtesies, but really they're deeply connected. They are embedded in the social life of my new neighborhood. Now, a disembedded exchange, that's where I go to the store and buy the halva and eat it in private, yeah? Or I buy it on Amazon, even better. These are market translations. They are using the medium of cash money. Arjuna Padarai is, and Pierre Bourdieu, we have many scholars who talk about this. My mentor, Leslie Kirk, has done wonderful things about this for the poetry of archaic Greece. I bring up this distinction of embedded versus disembedded exchange because when we talk about the materiality of poetry, we're not talking about a commodity. Poetry gets compared to commodities all the time, mostly luxury goods, yeah, textiles, finely embroidered things, pearls, and Aqsa Ijaz gave us the line by the poet Faza, that his poetry makes the jewelers of Surhan scratch their heads. That's to say that the poetry is more marvelous than a real pearl, and that the poet has outdone both the jeweler and the diver for the pearl, yeah? But when you think about dissemination of poetry in the pre-modern world, that's typically something shared, yeah? Shared by travelers at nocturnal gatherings or back at the Khan. or out on the road on Camelback. There's a lot. This is a classic, you know, a sort of primal scene of early Arabic poetry, describing how the poem gets disseminated, and everybody's at the uyun. Everybody's heard the poem before it even gets to you, thanks to this network of travel. These are embedded exchanges, and that's how I'm going to close for now, for real, I mean, with really, literally, the corniest, most affectionate thing I could say, which is that all our materials in this conference, the poetic artifacts, the commentaries on the commentaries, and even printed texts, these are all goods with material weight, but they're embedded, I should really hesitate to say this, but I believe that our materials are goods that are essentially embedded. God knows, none of us make money from them. What we get is symbolic. That's to say, it's meaningful, and we try to spread the meaning around. And this is in truth where I end, with thanks to my co-organizers and thanks to everyone here. Our materials are embedded goods that can't be loaned, Hany, and they can't even be given away. They can only be shared. And one of the places they're embedded, here's the corny part, it's in our hearts, and in the hearts of the women and men who recited and copied and exchanged the texts for us to enjoy and work on and share with each other for the past 3 days. My heart is full. My head is even fuller. I've learned so much. Thank you to all the presenters, to all the hearers, again, to my co-organizers, for a wonderful 3 days. Thank you. And I invite Hany and Huda also to share our overflowing hearts, the thanks. And Michael too, turn your mic on. Let's woo. Yeah, that's it. We haven't had enough of that emoji. Ooh, I'm gonna put it up there too.
Nothing after this, David. Our hearts are full. Thank you very much. Everyone, participants, audience, Hany and David, it's a pleasure. It was a pleasure organizing this carnival with you.
It's a real carnival full of beautiful flowers. We were like, it was intensive learning conference. I learned a lot myself, and I had a really good chance to meet new people, even virtually. We would love to have you in person and we communicate together as we used to, but it turned out that we have a real beautiful carnival gathering, and we are all grateful for your presence with us. So we thank you from all our heart. Thank you so much for making this wonderful event. And hopefully we will record, we have recorded all these presentations. So we will try to edit them professionally, and we publish them on YouTube, on different platforms, and we will also share them with you, so you can share them wherever you want as well. So thank you, and we appreciate your time and all.
Hany, on technical issues and the help, we need to thank Rawad, the magician behind the
Yes. Without the magician Rawad, we would never be able to manage this technology. We belong to a really ancient generation. So Rawad was yes. So Rawad had magical fingers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rawad. Thank you, Huda. It was a real pleasure working with you and David. Thank you.
Ma salam.
Ma salam. Thank you, Michael, again.